If I could tell you how you're going to die, what your exact cause of death will be, would you want to know? Most of us, it turns out, say no. We would not like to be able to predict our own death. This has actually been studied by psychologists. A global study published just last month by the American Psychological Association found that 87% of us say, no, we would not like to be able to see into the future. Whether it's little things like if our favorite sports team will win their next game, or big things like if our current marriage will end in divorce, virtually all of us say, no spoilers, please do not tell me about my future. And in fact, only 1% of people worldwide consistently say, yes, if it were possible, I would like to know exactly what the future holds. Now, I am a futurist. My job is to help people make sense of how the world is changing so they can anticipate what the future might be like. So as you can imagine, study results like this might sound like bad news to someone like me, because if nobody wants to know what the future will be, then what's the purpose of my work? But I want to tell you something. Even though I have been a professional futurist for more than a decade, I don't want to know what the future will be either. I really don't. And that may sound like a strange thing for a futurist to say, so let me explain. The great British author Virginia Woolf once wrote, "The future is dark," which is the best thing the future could be, I think. Now, she didn't mean dark as in depressing or full of terrible things. She meant dark as in unseeable, unknowable. And I agree, a dark, unseeable future is a wonderful thing, because if we can't see exactly what the future will be, then it can still be anything until it actually happens. We can change it and shape it through our actions. We can make it whatever we can imagine. It's a waste of what the future is really good for to try to predict it. The gift of the future is creativity. To create something new or make any kind of change, you first have to be able to imagine how things can be different. And the future is a place where everything can be different. And I do mean everything. I teach a class at Stanford University's Continuing Studies program called How to Think Like a Futurist. And on the first day of class, I always challenge my students to try to stump me and my fellow researchers at the Institute for the Future. I ask my students to come up with a list of things they believe will not change in the future. Things that are true about how the world works today that will definitely still be true at least 10 years from now. Things like humans will still need oxygen to breathe, or countries will always have borders, or you need genetic material from a man and a woman to make a baby. I hear that one every time. So I take whatever list my students come up with back to the Institute, where my colleagues and I search for clues that these seemingly unchangeable things are already, in fact, starting to change. Because if there is one thing that futurists are really good at, it's keeping an open mind about what can and cannot become different. And sure enough, just the last time I taught this class last fall, a few weeks in, some news headlines came out. The first 3-parent baby is born using an experimental method that's legal in only a few places in the world. It's called pronuclear transfer, and it combines the DNA of 2 women and 1 man to make 1 baby. It's being used to help parents avoid passing on genetic diseases. Now, you may not be a geneticist, and you may not be thinking about having a baby, certainly not a 3-parent baby, but this mental habit of always challenging what you think can and cannot change, of trying to unstick your mind about what might be possible by actively looking for evidence that literally anything can become different, even something that has been true so far for all of evolutionary history. This kind of psychological flexibility gives you a powerful foundation for innovation and making any kind of change in your life, your organization, your industry, your community. And futurists have lots of techniques like this for helping unstick the mind about what is possible. And I'm going to teach you some of these techniques right now. So first, I'd like all of us to imagine something. Every single person in this room made exactly the same decision about what to do today. We all woke up and decided to come here. But what if you had made a different decision? What if when you woke up this morning, you decided on the spur of the moment to go to the airport and go somewhere interesting? If you had made that decision, where do you think you would have gone this morning? Where would you be on your way to right now? And don't say home because that's boring. I want you to try to answer this question, and when you have a clear answer in your mind, imagine it as if you had actually done it. You went to the airport, you're on your way somewhere. When you know where you were going, I'd like you to please stand up. Great. Where are we going? Hawaii. Where are you going? London. Excellent. Okay. Now, look around you. Right now, every single person in this room has in their head a different version of how today could have played out. Instead of just one possibility, what actually happened, we now hold in our collective imagination hundreds of different possible realities. So that's fantastic. Thank you. You can take a seat. What we just did together is something called predicting the past. You think about an action that you took or a choice that you made, and then you ask yourself, what if I had done something different? How might my day have gone differently? Or how might my entire life have turned out differently? And you can ask yourself this about little decisions like we just did together, or big turning points in your life. What if I hadn't moved and I were still living where I grew up? Or what if I hadn't taken that job or opportunity that changed my life? What might I be doing today instead? And even though this technique is focused on the past, it's still really interesting to futurists because it helps us see that the present moment was not inevitable, that the choices we made in the past shaped the present. And if the present is not inevitable, then the future is not inevitable either. We can still shape it with the choices we make right now. And it's not just futurists who really like to use this technique. It's often used in the treatment of depression. So one of the major symptoms of depression is feeling like the choices you make and the actions you take don't matter, that nothing will change. But predicting how the past and the present could have been different by making different choices helps all of us see that the choices we make really do matter, and maybe that we have more choices available to us than we realize. Because when you develop the habit of predicting how you could have done something very different in the past, it gets easier to imagine how you might do something very different tomorrow. Let's try another one of these techniques. Right now, we're all going to try to imagine ourselves doing something we have literally never done in our lives, something you've never even imagined doing until right this very moment. And the way we're going to come up with this previously unimaginable thing is with a method called the XYZ method, and here is how it works. X is something you love to do, any favorite activity. It could be reading, dancing, baking, swimming. So I want you to pick an activity you love. That's your X. Does everyone have an X in mind? Okay, now you're going to pick a Y. A Y is a person you care about. It can be anyone you know, as long as they're still alive. Does everyone have a person in mind? And now you're going to pick a Z. A Z is a favorite faraway place. It can be anywhere in the world as long as you've been there at least once. Does everyone have a place in mind? Okay, now I want you to imagine it is 1 year from today, and you are doing X with Y in Z. You are doing that thing you love to do with the person you care about in this favorite faraway place. And if you've actually done this strange combination of things before, change one of your X, Y, or Z's so it's something you've never done, okay? And I want you to vividly imagine this. Like you could close your eyes and see the movie playing in your mind. You can see it happening. And when you can see it happening in your mind, I'd like you to please stand up. Keep picturing it as vividly as you can. Savor this future memory. Okay, great. Thank you. I can see how much imagination we've activated. You can take your seats again. And what we just did is called remembering the future. The way it works is you take people, activities, and places that you have real life experience with, and then you combine them in unfamiliar, unexperienced ways. And you try to imagine yourself doing this strange thing you've never done before as vividly as you can with as much detail as if it had already happened, as if it were a favorite memory that you could just call into your mind at will. And you get bonus points if you can explain some logical reason that you would be in that place doing that thing with that person. What turn of events might have led you there? And it can be hard to come up with a logical explanation for a randomly generated future. But here's something interesting that happens when you practice this technique. Every time you imagine yourself vividly doing something you have never done before, you rate that possibility as more likely to actually happen. And this has to do with what happens in your brain when you imagine something vividly. It creates something like a memory. The next time you try to think about it, your brain can conjure it up more easily. It can draw on the details you previously thought of. They're encoded in your memory now. And then your brain says, that was pretty easy to imagine, so it must be possible, because impossible things are hard to imagine. When you understand how this technique works, you can use it in really meaningful and purposeful ways. For example, I have a colleague at the Institute for the Future who does peace-building work in Sudan. And as part of her work, she asked community leaders there to imagine the practical, everyday details of life in a peaceful Sudan 10 years in the future. And by creating these memories of a peaceful future, it helps these leaders continue to believe that this urgent goal is realistic and possible, that it could actually happen, so that they stay engaged with this incredibly difficult work. I have another colleague who works with displaced populations, most recently Syrian refugees in Greece. And he's been asking children in these refugee camps to tell vivid stories and draw pictures of where they might be living 10 years in the future. Because the ability for these children to imagine how their lives could become different, how their future could really be different from their current reality, is incredibly important to their psychological well-being and their resilience. All right, let's try one more technique together. And this time, we'll try to imagine ourselves doing something that feels outside of our present reality, that it might feel hard to relate to, maybe even impossible to imagine in our own lives. And the best way that I've found to practice this technique is just to go to any news source and look for a story about someone going through something in real life, experiencing something that I myself have never personally experienced. For example, I recently read a story about two young women who live in rural India. They're sisters, and they live in a village so small and conservative that whenever these women want to go to the nearest city, for example, to see a movie, they are accompanied by a number of their male cousins and uncles who actually form a physical chain around the women. The men grab their hands and create a physical chain around the women, and that's how they move through the city to protect the women from any unwanted contact with strangers. Now, I'm not familiar with this custom. I've never experienced it, but I wanted to imagine it, and I'd like you to imagine it as well. What if all of us in this room were expected to start living our lives by this custom today? What if every time we wanted to go somewhere, we might be surrounded by strangers, for example, a conference like this, we were expected to enlist some of our relatives to come with us and form a protective chain around us? Or what if we were the relatives being enlisted and we were expected to play that role in someone else's lives and coordinate with them whenever they wanted to go somewhere they might be surrounded by strangers? And I don't mean imagine yourself going to rural India and doing this. I mean imagine this in your actual life as part of your daily routine. This may seem unimaginable, it may seem ridiculous, but I want you to try to picture it, and when you have a feeling or an image in your mind of being inside this human chain or helping form it, I'd like you to please, one more time, to stand up. This one's a little harder, right? This is the hardest of the techniques. Excellent. Thank you. For those of you who were able to imagine this, thank you. And you can be seated. So what we just did, for those of us who don't have firsthand experience with this custom, is something called hard empathy. It turns out there are two kinds of empathy. The first kind, the easy kind, is what we feel when we have firsthand experience with what someone else is going through. And so we can naturally relate, and we can actually feel in our own minds and bodies the emotion that someone else might be feeling. It's like a shared vicarious feeling. That's the easy kind. The hard kind is more of a creative, constructive act. It's what we need to do when we have no personal experience with what someone else is going through. We have to use our intuition and logic and creativity to try to figure out what it could possibly be like to be in that very different situation. We have to make a kind of imaginative leap. And every time we make that leap, every time we feel in our own minds and bodies how someone else's life could be completely different from ours, we get better at envisioning change of all kinds. Because when we can feel how someone else's life can be so different today, it gets easier to imagine how our own lives could be different tomorrow, or the lives of everyone around us, how the rules that we live by could possibly change. There's a slide missing from my deck. That's interesting. Well, these 3 techniques that we just practiced, I call it the triangle of what if. This is predicting the past, remembering the future, and hard empathy. And you can use this triangle anytime you want to approach a problem with more creativity or flexibility in your thinking. All 3 of these techniques have been shown in the scientific literature to increase innovation, open-mindedness, inventiveness, and capacity for change. And that's because at their heart, all 3 of these techniques strengthen the neurological pathways that your mind needs in order to be able to imagine how things can be different. And this brings us back to where we started. To create something new or make any kind of a change, you first have to be able to imagine how things can be different. And as you all just proved with your own imaginations, the future is a place where everything can be different, and the past is a place where everything can be different, and other people's lives are places where everything can be different. And I encourage you to spend as much time as you can in these different places if you want to make a difference in the world and in people's lives with the products and services that you create. Because as I constantly remind myself, to make a difference literally means to make something different. When you get good at imagining how things can be different, you start to understand why, that slide was in the wrong place, why so many futurists have adopted this as their mantra. And if you came to visit us at the Institute for the Future, you would see these words painted on our front window. Any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. I would like to share with you some ridiculous ideas about the future, ideas that I think might inspire you to imagine different products and services you might want to help create and build 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or even 20 years from now. So here's one ridiculous idea. This is called the Easy Lift Pay Station ecosystem. So can you imagine if our physical environment knew how much physical activity we had already done today using our phones or maybe wearable devices, and if we had not taken enough steps or exercised enough, it would charge us to use the escalator instead of taking the stairs, right? If you've already gotten your 10,000 steps in, no problem, you can ride the escalator for free, but if you've only taken 100 steps today, it's gonna cost you if you wanna take the easy way up. And you can see there's a little pay station over there if you need to up your money on your balance. So I want you to imagine if our physical environment were trying to change our behaviors in these ways. Would it be persuasive or coercive, I wonder, as Nir had suggested? And can you imagine a world in which corporations design their buildings this way, or cities design their public infrastructure this way? So hold that ridiculous idea in your mind. Here's another potentially ridiculous idea about the future. This is an idea for a service called Daymaker, where your job is to make someone else's day better. And you can think about this as kind of like the Uberization of mental health services. What if we had a whole fleet of mental health workers, the way we have a fleet of Uber drivers today? And what if those individuals could be trained in simple techniques like helping somebody decatastrophize their thinking, so cognitive behavioral therapy techniques? What if you could simply remind somebody with an idea for a self-care practice? Have you had a glass of water today? Did you know that dehydration actually mimics symptoms of depression? What if you could just be there to listen to somebody else, and this could be your job, to let somebody vent their stress to you. Can you imagine a world in which we had as many mental health workers as Uber drivers? There are actually people working on platforms like this, so maybe it's not such a ridiculous idea, but it's something that I would like to pose to you. How about a world in which we no longer use mirrors as we use them today? What if all of the reflective surfaces around us, instead of reflecting our current selves, were showing us images of our future selves? And those images were more fit and vibrant and attractive and healthy, or less vibrant and attractive and healthy, depending on the choices that we had made that day or the behaviors we had taken, taking into account what we're eating, if we're smoking, are we exercising, are we meditating? What if mirrors showed us our future selves instead of our current selves? And you can imagine this working with augmented reality technologies or replacing mirrors with interactive screens. Can you imagine a world in which people's behaviors would be shaped by constantly reflecting not on what we look like today, but what we might look like tomorrow? And the last possibly ridiculous future, although seeming more and more probable every day, that I want to share with you is this is a design mock-up of what someone might be doing on their commute home now that all of our cars are automated and nobody has to drive themselves during their commute anymore. So you might have time to do things like come up with a shopping plan where the food will arrive at your door timed at the same time you will arrive there, taking into consideration traffic patterns and your possible delay. Now, this image of the future has somebody doing something really healthy while they're in their self-driving car. It's possible we might just be doing work mail, Facebook, or playing games. But I wanted to pose this future to you because I think this is a really interesting space to design for. That is very possible that many of us will have more free time in the future when self-driving cars become more commonplace. And what will people want to do with this time? How will we want to take advantage of it? And what kind of location services and location awareness might be useful to build into the services we design for what you can do while you're in your self-driving car? So how do we come up with these ideas for what the future might be like? This is one last futurist habit I'll share with you. So we look for signals from the future. And these are the clues I mentioned earlier, clues that seemingly unchangeable things are in fact already starting to change. There's a great quote by the science fiction writer William Gibson who said, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." That really helps explain what we mean by looking for signals, because the technologies that will shape the future are already being prototyped in some lab. The scientific breakthroughs that are going to change the future are already being studied and experimented with at universities around the world. The weird consumer behaviors that are going to drive the things that we create are already being early adopted by different demographics around the globe. And if you can find these changes, find these clues, find these signals early on, then you have a lot more time to think about how to respond and what you want to amplify, the signals you want to make into a widespread phenomenon are, and maybe which signals you want to dampen that you don't want to have that much of an influence on the future. So I'm going to end by sharing with you a series of signals that I think are going to be really exciting for designing all kinds of technologies and services in the future. And these are all technologies and signals that have to do with how we detect our emotional states and how we share that information with others. So these are all things that exist today. So the first series I showed you, images of the future, everything I'm going to show you now actually exists. This is an app called Priori, and it listens to your voice to detect your mood and emotions. It listens for your word choices, your speed of speaking, your tone and volume, and it was developed for people who suffer from manic depression so they could predict if they were heading into a manic or depressive phase, and then the app could tell them based just on their voice. Now you can imagine if Alexa and Siri are constantly listening to our voice and detecting our changes in mood before we even realize that our mood is changing. This is a technology called Emotion, and it uses cameras to detect what people are feeling, and you can do it for an individual, say sitting at their computer, or you can do it for a room. So imagine if I, the speaker, could have all of this feedback about what you guys are feeling right now. This technology was actually just bought by Apple, which futurists consider that a big signal. Anytime Apple buys a company that is in a new field, it means that field will probably be important in the future. Researchers at MIT recently developed a technology that can detect people's emotions using a Wi-Fi radio signal. So this is really interesting. You don't have to be in front of a screen. You don't have to be wearing anything. You could just walk through a door or be in a room, and by bouncing these radio signals off of you and using that to detect things like your breathing rate and your heart rate, it can tell your arousal levels, your stress levels, and different aspects of your emotion. So people might not even be aware that they are in a space where their emotions can be detected, but they can be. Researchers at Max Planck University in Germany recently figured out that the chemistry of air in a room changes with people's emotions, that you can detect crowd level emotions. You can tell whether people are in a great mood, whether there's a lot of humor going on in the space, whether people are scared, they're anxious, they're bored. You can detect that through changes in chemistry in the air. So you can imagine having just a little device that's constantly measuring the collective emotion of a room, of a building, of a common collective space, and what might you do with that? Some of you may be familiar with the Emotiv neurosensing device. It has 14 different sensors to detect a wide range of emotions, and a lot of people are using this device to integrate with biofeedback and help people see their emotions and change them in real time. This is an app called Mooditude. It's a social network for sharing your emotions. They have a kind of a fun little interface where you dial different levers to say whether you're nervous or sad or excited or happy, and then you just send out these personal mood updates to your social network. This is the Intel Adrenaline dress. This was shown off at their high-tech fashion show recently. The way this works is that there's a sensor in the dress that detects the level of adrenaline in your sweat. And the more adrenaline you have going, the more this weird scaly thing on the back comes out, almost like a velociraptor or something. So if you are really jacked up or stressed out or ready to fight, you are communicating it to the world with your fashion. And they know to stay back. The last signal I wanted to share with you is a device called Thync, T-H-Y-N-C. This is a device that can alter your mood. It stimulates your vagus nerve using transcranial stimulation. It just sits right here, and it can change you from being bored to excited, or being stressed out to being calm. There are peer-reviewed studies on this. I've tried it. It definitely does seem to do something, but so maybe in addition to sharing your thoughts and feelings, you might be able to actually transmit them to other people as well. And I will say there's one more signal that I didn't have time to put in this deck, but I wanted you to know about. In about 10 days, Facebook is set to announce a new technology that people are saying it seems to be some kind of a mind-reading technology that will allow you to share your thoughts and feelings directly with others in your social network. They're announcing it at their F8 summit, so it's like 10 days from today. So you have 10 days to think about this before all the other Facebook developers in the world are thinking about it. So that's my gift to you. I would say what we do as futurists is we add up these signals to figure out what kind of future we might get, for better or for worse. And that's the creative opportunity I want to leave you with. You can use your positive imagination and think about what you might want to help people measure, track, or when you might want to help people share their emotions. If you were able to bake in this kind of artificial intelligence as sensing technology into the products and services you design, why would you want to help people share or track? When would you do this, in what context? And you can also use your shadow imagination and imagine all of the ways this technology could go terribly wrong, especially if we're coercive about it or we develop dark patterns. If you were to measure, broadcast, or share emotions in the products and services you designed, what bad habits might be created, or what dark patterns might become popular? So imagine what could go wrong. You probably have, I would say, a good 3 years to figure this out before these technologies become commonplace. If you'd like some other ideas about what might happen, The Institute for the Future, we asked 10,000 high school students what they hope and fear for from these technologies at a website called facethefuture.org. High school students are probably going to be the early adopters for these technologies, so we thought that would be a good group to ask. And you can see all of the conversations they're having. Each little bubble here represents a different teenager weighing in on a different possible future. So come and see what these 10,000 high school students thought. I hope you will take these futurist habits and continue to imagine the future. And I hope that every single person in this room will be making products and services over the next decade that create positive habits and positive change using some of these technologies. Thank you for sharing your imagination with me today.